Growing up, Thanksgiving Day was like a much needed break for me. Be it from school, work, or whatever, it was a breather before the hectic Christmas season that was just around the corner. Thanksgiving is one of those holidays that people from different cultures can identify with. Today, Thanksgiving is a time of celebration, feasting, and family. Many cultures all over the world have a similar celebration. As a second generation immigrant, it's definitely the biggest American holiday celebrated in my household, as I am sure it is in many immigrant households. Thanksgiving's Day's origin is, however, not the fairy tale we were taught in school. It's a tale of betrayal, persecution, hardships, deceit, and death. During the 1600s, present day New England was home to the people of the First Light. They were a variety of communities within several confederations. They called the land that they inhabited the Dawn Land. Their political leaders had been trading with Europeans for well over 100 years before the Pilgrims. However, the relationship between the Europeans and the people of the First Light understandably soured when the Europeans began to kidnap the natives to sell into slavery. Mistrust of Europeans and an already high native population made permanent European settlements impossible at the time. In 1616, European traders introduced a disease to the people of the First Light that wiped out 90% of the population within 3 years in several confederations. The Wampanoag was one of the confederations affected. Their leader, or sachem, as the Native Americans referred to their leaders as Massasoit, knew that their neighboring enemy, the Narragansett, were poised to subjugate them. The Narragansetts were not affected by the disease, so they had a huge numerical advantage. Massasoit was determined to keep his people free from Narragansett rule. This was the political world that awaited the Pilgrims in the New World. On the 6th of September 1620, the Mayflower set sail from Plymouth, England, to the New World. The Mayflower consisted of 102 passengers. The passengers were a combination of religious separatists in search of a new home where they could freely practice their faith and people who were in search of riches, land ownership, and a chance at a new life that the New World promised. These are the people we refer to as pilgrims today. The separatists were a branch of the English Puritans. King James hated the Puritans and began to persecute them in 1604. It was either conform and accept his church or expulsion and imprisonment. So the separatists fled to Holland, where they were free to practice their faith openly. But the more time they spent in Holland, the more they feared that they would eventually lose their national and communal identity. So they decided that they wanted a place of their own, a place free from outside influences, and they decided that that place would be in the New World. The separatists were then granted a patent by King James that gave them the rights to establish a colony in the New World. King James was just happy to be rid of them. He did not care much for their success. After 66 days of treacherous sailing, they finally landed in the New World, near the tip of Cape Cod, far from their intended destination, which was the mouth of the Hudson River. 16 men were sent ashore to scope out the area. The settlers did not know how to fish, and food was running out. They had no choice but to steal from Native American households, storage holes, and even graves. The stealing and the grave robbing led to their first hostile encounter with the natives. Fortunately, no one was killed. Unfortunately for the separatists, the encounter meant that they once again had to set sail in search of a new home. The odd thing was that the separatists originally planned to sell fish to pay off the debts that they took on for the voyage to the New World. It just seems irresponsible to not have a fisherman amongst them. About a month after landing on Cape Cod, the Mayflower crossed the Massachusetts Bay, and on December 12th, they reached New Plymouth and began construction on their colony in January. Their first winter in the New World was extremely brutal. Many of the pilgrims remained on board the Mayflower, where they suffered exposure, scurvy, and outbreaks of contagious diseases. On March, the remaining pilgrims finally moved ashore. Only about half of the Mayflower's original passengers and crew lived to see their first spring in the New World. On the very same month, they were surprised with a visit from Samoset, a Native American that greeted them in English. Samoset explained to them that they were building on top of a village called Patuxet, whose entire population perished from the recent epidemic. The land belonged to the Wampanoag Confederation, and their chief, Massasoit, was keeping a watchful eye on them. The settlers were running low on supplies and thus they were eager to trade, so Samoset returned several days later with companions and supplies. Among the companions was Tisquantum, aka Squanto. Squanto then informed them in perfect English that their sachem, Massasoit, had also come along with them. The locals did not trust the Englishmen, so to ensure their safety, Edward Winslow was sent as a hostage. Edward Winslow would later go on to be the third governor of New Plymouth. With Squanto's help, New Plymouth's governor, William Bradford, and the sachem were able to strike a peace treaty. The treaty ensured mutual protection if they were attacked by enemies. Squanto also taught the pilgrims how to cultivate the land and proved to be a vital interpreter. For the settlers, he was a godsend. Squanto, however, had schemes on his mind. Squanto had actually been kidnapped by Captain Thomas Hunt in 1614 to be sold into slavery in Spain. Squanto was able to escape to London, where he took up residence with a merchant who taught him English. The merchant also helped Squanto return to his homeland by arranging for him to be an interpreter on an exploratory expedition. However, Patuxet, Squanto's village, was no more. It had been wiped out by the recent epidemic. Massasoit took Squanto in because he was in dire need of a translator to communicate with the newcomers. But he never truly trusted him. The sachem eventually sent a trusted warrior, Hobomok, to live among the settlers to keep an eye on Squanto. Come November 1621, the settlers had a bountiful fall harvest thanks to the natives. To celebrate, Governor Bradford called for a feast and invited the colony's native allies. Massasoit showed up with 90 of his warriors and 5 deers to feast on. The feast also contained fowl and, of course, the fruits of their labor. The pilgrims did not have an oven, and their sugar supplies surely would have dwindled significantly. Thus, historians believe that the majority of the dishes were Native American inspired. The feast did not have cakes, pies, or any of the desserts that we associate with Thanksgiving today. The feast lasted for 3 days and is now remembered as America's first Thanksgiving, although it's unlikely that the Pilgrims would call this a Thanksgiving Day. In their faith, a day of Thanksgiving was a day of fasting and praying. During New Plymouth's first year, Squanto had plotted to overthrow Massasoit. He realized he had substantial power as the only interpreter amongst his people. He persuaded the locals he could command the English to make war or peace. He promised them that once he was in charge, they could take the fight to the Narragansett with the aid of the Englishmen's weapons. Hobomok grew increasingly suspicious of Squanto and warned the governor. Soon after, they discovered Squanto's scheme, which angered Massasoit greatly. Massasoit demanded Squanto be turned over to him, but Governor Bradford refused. The interpreter was vital. However, according to the peace treaty that the two leaders agreed to earlier, Squanto's life belonged to the sachem. The governor conceded, but just as he was about to hand over Squanto, an unidentified ship appeared which set off alarms in the colony. The alarm delayed Bradford, which worried the warriors that Massasoit sent. Angered, they left. Squanto remained with the settlers until his death. The unidentified ship carried 60 Englishmen who planned to set up a colony near Boston. These new Englishmen abused the Massachusetts natives. The natives grew increasingly angry and constructed a plan to kill the new colonists. New Plymouth's leaders were warned about the plot, and they launched a preemptive strike to save their countrymen. The aftermath of the strike brought peace for a time enough for new settlements at least. Eventually, the natives were outnumbered in their own homeland. New Plymouth's treaty with the Wampanoag lasted until Massasoit's death, but other Puritan settlers were not concerned with peace. To them, the Native Americans were the dangerous others, wild, savage, and godless. With an ideology like that, peaceful habitation was impossible. Violence was unavoidable. They soon forced the natives to convert and give up their culture or be eliminated. The alliance between the Wampanoag and the Pilgrims was a moment of short lived tolerance. With more settlers came more violence. The settlers seized more and more land, capturing young natives for slavery and killing the rest. Some confederations, such as the Pequots, never agreed to a peace treaty negotiated by Squanto, thus leading to one of the bloodiest Native American wars ever fought. On 1637, in Connecticut, an axis of 700 men, women, and children came together to celebrate their annual Green Corn Festival. Unbeknownst to them, during the pre-dawn hours, the sleeping Native Americans were surrounded by English and Dutch pilgrims. They were ordered to come out, and those that did were killed. The Pequots who remained inside the longhouse were burnt alive. The next day, the governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, John Endicott, declared it a day of thanksgiving. With the wind of victory, the Pilgrims and their native allies continued to attack village after village. Countless natives were killed and sold into slavery. Bounties were placed on native scalps to encourage hostilities. After an especially successful attack on the Pequots at Stamford, Connecticut, the churches announced a second day of Thanksgiving. During the celebration, beheaded heads of natives were paraded through the streets. Not even the Wampanoag, once an ally, were spared. The beheaded head of their sachem at the time was impaled on a pole and put on display in New Plymouth, Massachusetts. It remained on display there for 24 years. The attacks became more and more brutal, with a day of thanksgiving and feasting after each successful massacre. George Washington eventually suggested that only one day be set aside for Thanksgiving each year. Later, during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln decreed Thanksgiving a national holiday. On the same day, he ordered troops against the Sioux tribe in Minnesota.